말해. 나는 나는 그지 님부터 비고네 디고샤야기 얘네 도스치는 그지 가르치바래라나 아주에 나 지금 미기벨에 안에 제가 지망아서 동안용아 주에 미기벨에 망보사고레스 나디 사바디 간사고레스네 안에 지금 게디게 랑도르기 마시비 안에 지금 몽바 마리바 티모 마리비 원기 안에 아주기 디바사고레스 지산다 디바사야기 디바텔라 카리오레스나 데 제비 카나마도 바다라시 카나마도 니레스 지산 디바세티니스나 두고레스 지산 디니기 디바사고 디바사야디 규가르리티네 사고레스네 규 안에랑기 게디가 랑도르 마시바 티모 다시 마리바 티시요 온게 사고레스 되게 생각도 디고 슈르와다 디고.
Good evening. So we've been looking for a while now in the confession chapter at how to purify negativities, past negativities, through the application of the four opponent powers. So last week in the verses we looked at, again, we are reminded of the vast stores of non-virtue that we have accumulated in lives, in this life and lives previous to this. Both deeds which are non-virtuous by nature, as well as those which are transgressions of stipulated negativities. And the underlying motivation for both of these is primarily ignorance or not knowing.
당주기 디버샤비 리우다 득심 망고슈베나네다 돔로지 파 뒤자바나 돔 다도 순고르 되는마 네 권비에 쟁가른 온숨도 네 탈저 동을 직sem게 야다야도 차살 때 데다 샤버르 데다 탐지 샤버기스.
And continuing with the presentation on confession, we come to the 64th verse. In the actual presence of my protectors, with palms joined and my mind terrified of suffering, I prostrate again and again, confessing everything to all of them.
dorduji siktina ma ngazuge dirima zibige da sikshini di da nimbo tobshu kone gangle mangu shusar da chazan domlu ma sona domdi di ma shugore domsene chazan mangu gyurshwa dorduji da domse orada.
These final two verses in this chapter summarize the bulk of this chapter, which was looking at the limb of confession. So here in the 64th and the next 65th verse, we summarize the process of confession through the four opponent powers.
디모고 원게 안에 가르쳐고 왔는데 디바사고레 디바딜 라시 카나다 제비 카나마도 디바인 사고레 디바딜에 사실 디슈라 디당 안쪽에다 디바샤세기 샤야기 디바디 갈래람나 다 라시 카나마도 제비 카나마도 바이 디바디샤고다 디디샤 뭐 시강아샤이 디바디 뭐 소마레마 다 그지데 다데는 딱 샤베 유디 안다 샤베 유디 가르레 샤유디 술레테네 샤고라스네 되네 공부 세대 다들 마셔고 공부 세대 샤베 유 샤유 등을 송고 띵게 겹 당어저기 대신 띵게 겹 등을 송고 띵게 당어저기 돼 제사 공부 세대 공부 안에 상예 점낸 상예 당 디세 자주선바 파파 안에 투시 자와 인지 첨부된 된되게 어디서 강사되게 공부 세지다 도스체네 샤유 등을 송고래.
Last week, we looked at how, in terms of the four opponent powers, we call to mind, with regret, past misdeeds. So both those which are by their very nature are misdeeds, as well as those which are transgressions of stipulated negativity. So both classes, one calls to mind what one has done, and recognizing that one did so out of ignorance or not knowing. So having now called to mind past misdeeds, one confesses. And to whom does one confess? Well, that is mentioned then in the first line, in the 64th verse, in the actual presence of my protectors. Here then, we confess to our protectors, namely the Buddhas and Arya Bodhisattvas.
Desugi, Jengar, Konzugi, Shegi, Miki, Tonsal Padia, or Jengar, Monsum Dusin, Padmons, Tonsal Pashuche, Chik Dusina, and the Shako, Saja, and combating of the Tibashadi, Tibadi, Raji Kanamada, Chiba Kanama to be Tibani Shako, and the Sula Chabe, Yudi Surias, and the Dingy to the Surias, and Sanjeta, D. Sage, and Jusima Papa, Saja. Diana Ganeshagri, Labdu Shako, and D. Dulia, Mosu Yubiketa. Duchen, my duation, the shower is Mosum, talk conjugiba, Mosu Sido Bachi, Jengan, Dangan didn't be to your vada, Pombuchili Jackie, Shevovena, Jika, Taran Buchilio, Matan was Millie Lane, Jukuya, Dan Kabata, Shevana, Mosu Tongo Marva. She's done as Mosura, Pombo Diesel, Jarch, Coron, Dundi, duation, Jipa, Shidu, Jengar. Korongi dundu ngoso tuaye ko ngosum tongorwa dina shin sanje da jenju sama papa desugi jenga konzu ngoso hanzo sidebe bablia dushine ya shugo rechele.
In the verse previous to this, the 63rd verse, we generated the power of regret. Here it's an opponent power of the basis, those to whom the confession is made. And as mentioned, this refers to the Buddhas and Arya Bodhisattvas. And as the first line says furthermore, in their actual presence. So what this means is, just like in our daily life, if we are going to apologize to someone, the experience of that apology is very different if it's made in person, as opposed to, say, a note is relayed via a messenger, or one telephones them, or so forth. When apologizing in their actual presence or directly, the apology is much more real to the person making it. So this is the meaning then of in the actual presence, or literally before the eyes of our protectors. So this is what we should have in mind when confessing to the Buddhas and Arya Bodhisattvas, that we are doing so in their very presence, with them right before us.
And the Sanje Dan, Jesus Papa the Ye, Anzula, Magic Tarn, Nushama, Tarn, Mugan, Cielo, Consum, the Ziturua, that then Anzuki see towards that didn't want some said the Sosugi, some data, and answer, the social some that deep shabby capla, that's also some data they can stand was in it. That's give you Sanje Dan, Jesus Papa the Rangi Dwindle, most you, some batch, social mebatel, when they rang Sanje Dan, Jesus Papa, when they they show you some big, so did Dwindle, when you, some big mebache, and the shower, let's work. She's not so rangi, didn't want some you, Sanje, I want to see you, and I want some you, Sebeda. Rangi Dwindlia, and the Jike, Shao Yu, Jang Jab, Sanje, and Jensen Papa, the young ones to show you, somebody wants some the Dulia, Marang, Dejena, and Tipo the Shao Yu, some Pegata, Duchina, Shao Yu said Tabia like Kabla, then set up what is that.
With this first line, in the actual presence of my protectors, then this is referencing from our perspective of the person who has generated regret and now is apologizing, confessing. So from our perspective, we should imagine that the Buddhas and Arya Bodhisattvas are right there, that they are directly receiving our confession. We are saying to them explicitly. So this word actual can be actual, direct, or explicit. So we explicitly or directly saying to them, this is what I've done, this is what I've done, this is what I've done. So we imagine ourselves in direct communication with the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And we do so ensuring that our confession is sincere and heartfelt as opposed to just a mere recitation of words.
Mandan dinigi tini top de sai tab de kabla rangi an ko mo sanje da di se chen shi san papa di rangi dun de le ngo su shu sam rangi de yi dun le ya ngo su jik du chen shu de chen ya an di pa sha gyu san pe da chen ge tini ge sha yu di pa sha yu di da du su ngo su sa ta pe sa ta de ne sa ta ne de ne an so so rangi di pa sha bi an 제비 갑라나 류간에 스토고래람나 수부조 다 되당간에 스토고라세네 제가 라니 테마자제 류 구비고네 안데 도시네 되고래세 되는 탈자르스우다 탈자 동아 지기 셈세 탈자르스도 류디 류 안라고 라니 테마자네 다 되네게 제비 상케다 전시스마 파바티겔이야 베네 심 딩기 아니 대바제지도 제제 도시네 안도시 류 타모자 안 나게 거네 안디나 저게 지게 되어가 되다디 샤베 치카르되나 되야디게 도시네 안되어 오래야지 탈자세 류기다 되다다디 넘주디 파송오래.
The power of reliance is being presented here. So we imagine or visualize, the word can be used in both ways, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas right before us. So we imagine ourselves to be in direct communication with them. Moreover then, in the second line, we see reference to our physical posture with palms joined. So here Shantideva is explaining our physical posture in that when confessing in the direct presence, we imagine ourselves in the direct presence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. We join our palms together in a position of humility before them in order to make the confession.
야도 차사데서 동아 지심기스데 다데 다 삼로기 다다 송으로다 다데시 류기 되다데 개유 사답디드는 슈유에서 비마바체 데네게 안데 소수기 되다 류디 되다시 다 삼로 가르당 거에서는 동아 지심기 시데 동아 시데다 저게 냐와 이다 든조 와 냐와 이다 든조라서 바다 데네게 안데 동아디 파 삼다이데 당아 저기 미 동아 제바이나 dunro dunga di pe ma se chik kalya khawa dunga mawa ane chik dunga se la tablam di shindu gomba ne doshine samda an di na shin na dile duga de ane ida da de ke kewa len bai na desu dunga di gyun renwa dunga chewa ane sela shindu ne kalya khawa an dele ma duga di kalya ne nyawa nibi 나 냐와나 차냐다 차냐로서 되네게 도 섬도 동안에 신돈 가하고래 스베 동안디게 되네게 삼다네 되네게 동안디게레다 마타네다 탑 미누 샘비게도 동안 되네 용어제 뼈 사사래 스베 동안 될레다 타고도 샘비게 아 삼다 다야다 안 딜레단 하다 밀레 깨베네야 다 하라 밀레네 중앙 투비게 동안 내암다 안세 천재 지비 동안 강함하고 도와서 제자들 동안 대솔을 차상 코비에 되네게 동안디게 차상 되서 동안디 용고고 있는데 뺏사샤다뇨 되지 동안디 타 고고도선 뺏삼다에도 되네게 동안디래 동안 직세오다 동아지 제자 동안에 지요도 다 대서 동안요 유디 가려서는 다 디바디게 돼서 제가 디바디 교야 디바디 다 되네게 디바디 용고도 다디 네 마샤나다 탑민도 선배게 되네 삼나 동아기 동가서래 디비 제보 동아들의 지신가 다디 용고면 디만 텔레 타야게 탑람디 가르스네 디바디 디바디 샤고도 삼제 되네 삼다제 동아 직sem기 디집에 sem기 삼로 온 되네 다디 되네 디바디 마찬 탑네 샤기 삼비게 데네기 디바 제바디게 베 노트레샤 디미누 셈베 노트레샤 인게바 게셈 게지게도 단님보 가서래 순진베 덥 차교로와 순진베 덥 차교로 데네기 게셈 게네 데네 야나야도 차설데 엔 디바샤 데네기 디바샤야게 제게 도스네 Deba Zichu Chen, Dipa Shagada, Lu Yukone Kewa, Tuya, Na Yukone Kewa, Yukone Kewa, Kewa, Gang to Vetico, Dus, Kartubene, and the Yado, Chasa, the Essen, the Nigga, some of the Netajin, and Dipa did that Dibu Kusava, the Jiminu, Sembig, that no Trukin Shas and Yaba Jet in it, Dipa de Pashagi and Sembig Dushin, Shawar, yes, Yana and Chasatis. Oh, Yana and the Chasatis ever.
The second line continues with palms joined and my mind terrified of suffering. The Shantideva is presenting the entirety of our physical engagement. We imagine the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas before us. We in direct conversation with them. So verbally, we are confessing to them. And our physical posture is one of humility with our palms joined. And then in terms of our mental attitude, we haven't merely recalled past misdeeds, but we have fear for their potential suffering results. And this is being mentioned for the same purpose as the other parts here, which is for us to make this confession with sincerity, to make this confession in a heartfelt manner. Not just a mere recitation of words, this and this and this has been done, but rather with a deep and sincere regret, confession is made. And when regret is sincere, this will be include the fear for the possible ripening results that will follow if one does not purify. So therefore there is a sense of urgency in terms of the regret that is being made, recognizing the grave faults that one has done. And here when we think of a mind that is terrified of suffering, this will refer both to the sufferings that are experienced in the lower realms as well as the higher realms. But in particular, one would turn one's mind to the intense sufferings of the lower realms, thinking of animals who experience such stupidity, but also stupidity in terms of not being able to resolve their problems and difficulties, and also being hunted and hunted for food. And then thinking that the unseen beings such as spirits, their suffering is even more intense, let alone the suffering of hell beings. And these imprints for such rebirths will be abiding on my continuum. Therefore, I must confess these now. And even if I weaken such imprints, I don't want them to ripen even as a human being, as a weakened result. I want them completely purified. If I want to attain a good rebirth as a human or God, but a rebirth still with as little suffering as possible. So in this way, we should understand a mind terrified of suffering. This is a mind of sincere regret. Then in the third line, we have our physical, the act of purification being expressed as prostrating again and again. So this then would be the power of the antidote, where one is engaging in a physical act of prostration with a mind of regret, as well as in relation to the power of the basis or reliance, the three jewels. So therefore we see here in the third line the expression of our regret, and expressed through physical prostration. And whilst it's not explicitly stated, we should understand this to be done with verbal recitation, perhaps of this verse or of mantra, so as to aid the purification process.
Anizada dunga jiksim ki sire di kapso nganzuge da kapsore sunjimbe topseti sungore dagaje dunga yedinike kamsumda dunga ingasunge dunga samda delya chitago de jizedi dunga yu difasadi pesasha sempege samdaje dushin dunga yedele tago dunga de gyenshi tong delji tong tago do di 유가르드는 용어는 디바들의 동 디바사와 녀마 지교디 베사샤 세베게 노주르샤스메 디딩미스메 겨바게요 겨바게 삼다이데 네 가서에 순진메 도 없어야지 자 다데네 대시 공부해야지 띵유도 다디디 삼다데 순진메 도 없어야지 디차고도 다 디니기 숨바데 양다 양도 차사데 다 디나 냠도 맞아 대다 탐제 샤버기 있어요. 제사다 양내 양도 차사 디니기 삼다네 아니 가르세 양내 양도 삼다지 파 안지기 가는 샤고레스나 디니 안지기 나기 안지기 nga zuge gom kar gyabe ne da ane gom gyabe na de changshu sem go na ninje gomba tongyo gomba ine ane ji lu yu go ne cha sa wa da nga ji go ne ane ji nga sa wa ka de be ge wa ka tu be na di da cha sa du chen cha sa ya ne ya du cha sa je si de ne che ne an di ba di ge tam je sha ho re sha di ba tam je di de da tam je sha ba gi se de ne di ba sha ho di ba sha tang du shi sha ho re se de di nyen bo kun du ji be top se sung ho de le ya je sang nyam len che de ju 고미야들 양 간에 샤워하잖아요. 데니게 삼다 군어디도네 안 야네 차차네 디바 샤워레세도 제사야네 차차데세도 예 nga yi yu ko ne jamni jo ko mya chanshu sim go ya tongban yo ko mya la so ba na de ne ge nga yu ko ne ne ji ge si ge nen de de ya la so ba da de ne ji nga da ya la so ba on lu ji ko ne cha cha wa da kon jo le cho bu ya de ne ge diba sha ge sha ya dan dal di chen ge wa tu ya de du shin tu ne diba de sha wa gi is sha wo re se du song ye de di ga su de nyen bo kun tu ji be top se de song ngo wa shiba da da ni ba ni sumba ni ga sumba ni dom gu do.
The first line of the verse related to the opponent power of reliance, in that in reliance on the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the protectors, one is engaging in confession. The opponent power of regret is what is referred to in the second line, explicitly or in particular by a mind terrified of suffering, because it's through understanding the suffering results that follow from an action, one understands that action to be negative. It's not merely negative because one has been told so, but because one has an understanding of the ripening results that will follow unless it is purified. So this then is the understanding behind the expression, a mind terrified of suffering. And then the third line, third and fourth line refers to the power of the antidote. So in the third line, it explicitly mentions, I prostrate again and again. So we should understand that a prostration as being an illustration of an antidote. One can, as has been mentioned many times, one can engage in any virtuous act as an antidote to non-virtue. Prostration being one, meditation on any virtuous topic, whether compassion or emptiness, or relying on Vajrasattva, any of these or other virtuous acts can serve as the power of the antidote. And when one does engage in prostration, as mentioned here as an example, prostration should be understood to be a physical expression of a virtuous mind of some sort. In other words, when one is engaging in prostration, one's mind should be involved in the process of purification as well. So prostrating with a mind of deep faith in the three jewels, or a mind of compassion whilst prostrating, or even with an understanding of emptiness whilst prostrating. So one shouldn't see prostration as merely a physical act, but recognize that it needs to be accompanied by a virtuous mind, should be seen as an expression of a virtuous mind. Then the final line in this verse, confessing everything to all of them. So this then concludes the verse by pointing out to whom or referring back to whom the confession is being made, and that there's no hesitation or restraint or selection in what is being confessed. All past misdeeds, without exception, are being confessed.
지간 시바디기 대다 탐지 샤바르 이스엔 대다 아시데 디간레 하산 셰데가 저기 디바 라신이 가나마도 바데 집에 가나마도 디바 대다 시고라 대다 디바 탐지 디다 탐지에 샤고레스 네 간에 샤고레 람나 네 야네 야도 차사데스도 야네 야도 안 지가 차고래 디 차단의 간에 차이라는 데니게는 루주군의 차세네래 나유군의 숭하사야래 이유군의 자주sem고가 인조범이야 아니 동요도 배셔라 kom야라서 두시는 kom네 샤고래스 안디메 루주군의 고라고야라서 봐 건절을 쳐다 개와 직 소수기 뉴비 바베게 개와 강주여줘 디 개와 되다 님베 또 프레스 진짜 데니기 개와 주요도 디바데 샤고래 세데 디바 샤탄데 데다 디바 샤탄데 간에 샤거는 데니게 개와 주요도 샤고래 지산 개와 주요 꾸노 데라다 데니게 코로에 나송게 둥알레 지베 삼마타 데니 디규 디바디게 제바데 티미노 셈베게 개와 삼도스제네 삼당오레세 지산 디가 소다 델레야 언지 식시시디기 안가스네 저기 디바 님보 도시군의 샤인의 띵유톱 안 띵유톱 상예다 전시선바 파베 가사 되게제 띵유톱체 나디들이야 뭐랑 모습도 수유세 베랑게 돈들이야 되게 사답 띵어수 소시나 띵어수 모습도 제규 셈베게 도시는 주의 뭐바체 텔레사답 얘네 안에 나 순진배 톱텔라 나송의 동화되게 봐 삼다 동화될 매직 탈게는데 뺏었을 동안에 용한다 강아지 주체서 동안에 타고도 선배 삼다이도 동아의 규디 가르세네 디바디게레 디바디 제가 디바디 제바디 노트 중샤 선배게 겨바 삼다이데 겨바 팀인의 선배 겨바게디 삼다이다 순침이었도 디네 겨바지네다 디바디 샤기 인생에 삼제 안데 고든리아 오스 샤기 선배게 삼다제 안데 야네 야도 소소게 계셔 주베디다 님보군도 주베도 없어야 차고 제가 대다 탐제 샤벌도 쓰는 님보군 교샘 샤유서 답 아니 교샘께 아니 되니게 삼다 교샘께 되네 님보군도 주 님보 냠는 제요도 아니 디바디다 탐제 샤비요 샤벌도 쓰는 샤고 그래서 자데 샤벌 이세데 디디 제일 셰유레다 디제 롱유레
There's the final line in this verse, confessing everything to all of them. So here, this is a very expansive line, encompassing a wide number of things. So it refers confessing everything, so all non-virtues that one has done, both what one can recall, as well as what one cannot recall but would have done, as well as those which are both non-virtuous by nature or stipulated negativities. All non-virtues that one has done, with none being kept hidden. Moreover, confessing everything to all of them. This then will refer to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and one can also then imply in this verse that our way of confessing is being done through our physical behavior, through our speech, and certainly through our mental attitude. So this can all be inferred in this fourth line. So for purification to have the desired effect, we need to utilize all four opponent powers. And in this verse, 3 are explicitly mentioned. So to purify, one needs to rely on all four opponent powers. And there is some variety in terms of the particular sequence. This is up to the individual, and certainly variety in terms of one's choice of antidote. So some will choose to engage in meditation and on any topic, whether compassion, emptiness, or any topic. Others would prefer to engage in something physical, such as prostrations or circumambulation or making offerings. So this is up to the individual. Ideally, it should be done certainly with one's mind, but also one's body and speech too. In looking at the lines of this verse, the first line is in terms of the four opponent powers, is the power of reliance, who one relies to, the protectors, namely the Buddhas and Arya Bodhisattvas. The second line then, with palms joined and a mind terrified of suffering, this refers to the power of regret. So if one's mind is terrified of suffering, clearly one will regret what one has done. And such, maybe you could say, colorful language is used here to illustrate that it's important that regret is sincere, so that one does turn away from habitual tendencies, from unwholesome habitual tendencies. And then in terms of the power of the antidote, that's at the third line, I prostrate again and again. And as mentioned, if one prostrates, one does so also with a mind that is focused on virtue. But one can engage in the power of the antidote of any type of virtuous activity that one is inclined to. And then the fourth verse summarizes what's being presented here. So again, this verse contains 3 of the 4 opponent powers.
And it is a dangan to Tivashayagi do some that the Nalang Dusine, the Tisi Dandadi Karadusina, and Dusine, Susana, Tusa, Yawashi, Lele, and Dine, and Susuki Dambodia, and Tivashapi, Dinu, Dr. Beautiful set up you got Susuki doing Delia, and the Sanye that changes in a public cancer ticket, Kungo Shuyu, Sampegi, Mevache, and the Kungo Shuyu, that Delia, Konzuki, Gobi, Nubadia, Contoli, Jogure, Sampegi, Yishepegi, Devachi to scare, and the Nishine Susi di Dulia, Döchendani, the Sanji, Sanje that changes good Dulia, Sosara, Debi Mevache, Yebi Mevache, and Mevachene. Dinigi Dushin Geneda, or that Jingan Jungasum Dungadiki Pa Samta, Tangasu Dunga Gangadiki, Dinity, Yores, that Dine Sosu that Sosu Mil Dedirat Gangat Young Woman, Maombana Gangan Dileki, Sombana Ganga, Be Duchar, that Dinigi, and the Gangar Chesina, Dungaja, Yon de Kiwi, Java Cheada, Dine Gopsa, Gine Meba, Dine Koya, Dunga Delia, Tayalea, Galak Hopushu, Yosare, do sometime. Deledda be jiktago udu sambege semsho kiyodu da dele tayade deyoyadu yugarchiosn diba yudi diba resha chesada diba di be notrichin sawati get notrisha da di diba savat nyama jikdiba jebati sawajin timinu sambe samda diminu notrisha sambe samda da gyoba gebarwa chesan timinu da di diba mashan tabme di shagi sambe da sanji da Gudulia, and Shaggy is some Taje, then the Tiba Shaga Tondalia, and Chasawa, Chobo Pua, and the Chigi, Dushin and Sosuki, Nagom Java, Garituba, and Duskava, to Skawa Chengadu, and Diba Shagota, the Dushi Ores, Gava didn't Strubu order.
When one engages in the process of confession, it's generally best to be somewhere quiet, without distraction around oneself. And then start by calling to mind the power of reliance, in other words, those to whom one is going to confess. And as this verse states clearly, call to mind the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and imagine them being present with one. So not to try and get beyond, to try and have this process of confession as being very real for oneself, as if one were confessing to them face to face. So if you in your room at home, where you have your statues, you have a consecrated statue of, say, the Buddha, and then you can, with a trust, this is a physical representation, but the actual omniscient consciousness of all the Buddhas is present. So feel their presence, and then in their presence, call to mind the various sufferings of samsara, those that you yourself have experienced, as well as those which you have observed in our world, as well as those that you've heard about in the teachings, recognizing that in these ways you are suffering, in these ways others are suffering, and such further sufferings await one, as long as one has non-virtuous imprints on one's mind. And thereby fearing unwanted results, fearing suffering, problems and difficulties, regret arises for the causes that we ourselves accumulated. In other words, we regret our past misdeeds. And here too, we need to generate regret in a way that for us is real, so that we have through having a strong regret for what has been done, then the other steps will become that much more powerful. The third that would is mentioned here is that of the antidote. So with strong regret, one's mind will be very focused on engaging in virtue so as to purify imprints on our continuum. And again, this can be done with prostrations, through making offerings, and if one is doing something physical like that, to ensure one's mind stays virtuous whilst engaging in a physical act, or one may prefer to meditate on a topic, and that too will serve as an antidote.
And then that in the Sanyabal alarm to some dishi or Masungore. Jembanamgi dagi dik nomba labar sundu solos, dine sangbo malape, lenche dani yongmi is.
So this verse contains 3 of the 4 opponent powers. The 4th opponent power, the power of the promise or the power of restraint, is in the next verse, the 65th verse. Spiritual guides, consider my negative acts to be mistakes, I beseech you. And as these are not wholesome, I shall never do them again.
Ana Jemba Namgi said the Jemba Nimbit to give you the Sangyetang, the Session Sem Papa, the Zone Jemba, said the Manzu Semja Tamje, ya, and Dunga say Tablam de Nyamsu Lenjo Lamdun Jia, to call you Dunga change ya. Yeah, and the Sanji Salia, Taba Tamji Kimbo Gohala Jaya, Tada Migo Holia, the Jamber Chendi, that is so Sanjeta Jason Papa Kaza Tiki, Tisa, Dele Jamba Namgis, Tikuran, Tues or Jamba Namgis, said the Deji, Dinny, Jeb Sanjeta Jason Papa Tikisungore.
The first term here, spiritual guides. So this refers to those who are guiding ourselves and other beings to the attainment of liberation from suffering and enlightenment itself, so the Buddhas and Arya Bodhisattvas.
On the Zada Jemba Namgi, Dagi dig Nongba Lapar Sundu Sola Sededa, Dagi Tisengi, Masola Yeki, Tipa Sayo Batiki Sigura Dagi Tipa, the next Sayo Batiki, Nongba no tree, Gyre, the Zan Gyun by the Kunju to Chena. Kembaji, Kingor, just a delia, that the nigger no chip delia, Alia, Tuzi, Wangi, and Alia, Chis Sundu Solos, Sunruchi said, Sundu Solos said, Sugar, that Tanga Namia, Kuri Dungala, Yem, was delia, Tayag, Tablam, the nigger, Dangene, and Dusine, yet you can also Ma call Humajuache, delia, Tablam Danger, ya, and General said, Sundu Solos said this morning. Jisangi no true, the nigger Korea Tungaji, Noyag, deeper side, Ben no true is, non was no true is, no true body, and can say Kingor, the Zangalia, Jiggy, the nigger, Zay Wangi, and Malia, Korea Tungaji, no more, Tibati, Shayalia, Baba, Shayalia, and Dushin, Jesus Sonto Solos, and just Sunroches and the Sugar Solos, and Yashuva.
And the verse continues, spiritual guides, consider my negative acts to be mistakes, I beseech you. So here one is addressing one's spiritual guides, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and saying directly to them, all the negative deeds that I've done, both those I can recall and those which are forgotten, both those in this life as well as lives previous to this, all of these negative deeds, whether negative by nature or transgressions of vows, all of them were mistakes, and I apologize for them. So here by saying, consider my negative acts be mistakes, one is implicitly stating that I recognize them as errors, as faults, as mistakes. So when that is further how we should understand what has been written here.
Dine Sambo Malape said, Dine Sambo Malape said, Dinigi Jiki Shanley, Nuba, and Dibiki Lera, Dine Lunga Yusmi, Dibi Lera Cheba, Jaju Dige, Yaku Mares, Sambo Mares, Yaku Mare, Jana Yapore Mendo, Yapu Meva, the Sosora Hakoson, Yapore Mendo, the Notre Reshas, Dine Sambo Malapes, Dine Inza, that did not reach Ware, Jesa Dine Zange, that didn't, and Lama. Sanjeta, Janjusemba di Dunia, 렌체 다기 용미기스 디린 친진 파 다디네게 디브이 레가 싸우기는 지금에 세디 담자 샤바데 지금에 세디 담자와 담제거로와 제사다 예발라 라르미도 톱세디 숨고래
The third line, and as these are not wholesome, so here one is saying directly to one's spiritual guides that these mistakes, they are not good in any way, they are unwholesome. And then the fourth line, and therefore I promise I shall never do them again. So here we are making the promise that from now on, from today, I will not repeat these mistakes.
제자 되네 인자다 디버디 인가 제비 디버디게 파 디버샤비게 샤유 제비사답 안 델야 안치 디비게 디비 제부디게 파 삼다이데 델레 강아체 델레데 디미누 섬 델레 동아 타고도 섬베게 타도게 삼로 슈침부시게 해도 디규 동아디게 녀모바디게 가서 녀모바서 디버디게 마파마다 탑면도 디버 제바 노트레샤 세 교바게 데니 디바디 디링에 샤긴 섬베게 샤비게 자와지는 개와도 디바디 샤 다 디버디 니 샤사회 제라 다 녀마데 샤사로 와다 매워서 살아봐. 다 되니게 냐마 디버지게 노트 임바딩이 하고 송도와다 상부 마임바 말라페세데 상부 마임바데 야부 멤바딩이 노트 임방이 하고 송되니 에자다 렌체 다기 용비제세다 디린 친친 바 디바사바데 사우인지 매 새벽에 담자 샤야도 되니 디바 담자 샤야도 되니 지금에 나이도 파 가송 삼바지 기교로와 지금 말씀드리는 디바 사바디 제마주 가샤바네 냐마지바지교디 바샤나 다바이네 되네 주야디 개와마도 디바야요 말와.
So in this verse we have come already to recognize that past misdeeds result in unwanted suffering. So therefore there's recognition already accumulated in the prior verse that I must purify negative acts. Therefore one is engaging in this process of confession. And recognizing these mistakes as being unwholesome, one is making the promise, I will not repeat these mistakes. So in this verse, which includes the fourth of the four opponent powers, the power of the promise, the purpose of making this promise or this commitment is that I will not repeat these mistakes I've made. I will not again engage in unwholesome deeds. The process of confession is to purify past misdeeds. The purpose then of this particular opponent power, the power of the promise, is not to repeat those mistakes, not to accrue new misdeeds.
아도 삼다다 데 돔마데 디버샤이 빌리우기 다 돔디 디버샤타데다 도스님부터 슈고네 샤타 디레세다 안주기 디버샤이기 디바디 용어서 라신이 가나마도 제베 카노마 디버샤이 디바디 소리에스 제산 디즈기 제부디 안행아 성이 개베 동안 용고레스 도시 삼다 대데니기 동아샤이 디바디 샤고도 메바소고도 안야 땡겨 또봐 개비 상계단 제시 셈바디게 제시 파바디게 랑게 둘이야사 답랑이 디도는 무슨 유선비고 메바체 되네 랑이라 테마자야다 안도시네 그 귀비고네 쉬네 되네 쉬제 안데다 삼다야들 이유고네 삼다야들야 안가 선수미 동아디게 삼다 되네게 동아 용어제 백강아 체살 될레데 타고도 셈베 타르도게 삼도게 제가 디요에 귀디 디바데 샤샤바네 될레 타르게 제가 디바데 디레마션 타빈 디바샤기 삼베게 디바제바 노르레샤디 디미누 삼베게 요셈게제 되네 디바샤기 셈제 데 도시는 삼다제 당아도 계주주에 돼 샤바데 님베데 님보 대야되다 님보 돕세야되 다 계절 가르나 계절 주비야 차거와 두생 계절 줍다 계절 줍 차위 제일이야 근데 다 네 노트 제바되게 하나 상계다 대시 상계다 주선 받음지게 하는 게 노트 제바되 하나 하고 소디 노트 임바데 이제 안데서 투세 원경아 안지게 냐라 제수 손도서 집에 소아 답제 땅이 렌치네 있는 the no dream batting a how, then is a luncheon in Mount the beach I was talking to Mea, Sempe, Domsem Geja, two sin Domsem Georges, then is ever another device, Nimbo Topshu and the Tibashase, then she has a the body to see and that somewhere.
Can summarize the meditation on confession, but first to make the point, these four opponent powers should all be included. The particular order of the opponent powers, this is up to you, what you find most effective at that time. But do include all four opponent powers. And moreover, for the process of purification to be effective, what you generate within needs to be sincere. So if, for example, one starts with the power of regret, here one, again, recalls past misdeeds that one has done, as well as those which one cannot recall, but one knows, if not in this life, certainly in lives previous to this, one would have done. And through recalling their karmic results that will follow, one generates regret. So it's our fear for future suffering that may well be experienced in the lower realms, or suffering that we have already experienced and may experience again in the human realm. It's that fear that will lead, that fear of suffering, that will lead to sincere regret. And when this, the strength of the opponent power of regret has a great influence on the strength of all the opponent powers. So too, the opponent power of reliance. So this is referring to the protectors or the spiritual guides, so the Buddhas and Arya Bodhisattvas, those to whom one makes the confession. And here, as we saw in the previous verse, we should believe that we are in their presence, and that this process of confession is being made directly to them, as if it was face to face. The Tibetan literally is before the eyes of, so right in front of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, one is saying aloud to them, I have done this, and I've done this, and I've done this. So when one is confessing something to someone directly, this has a very powerful impact on the mind. And so too, when one comes to the power of restraint, or the power of the promise, where one promises not to repeat this, imagine that you are making this promise directly to your spiritual guides, to the protectors. Because in this way, the promise to refrain from repeating such errors will be so much more sincere, and therefore have a deeper impact on the mind. And then again, in terms of the power of the antidote, the fourth of the four, this is any virtuous deed. One can spend some time in meditation on impermanence, or on compassion, or on love, or on emptiness, or one can engage in recitation of something of sutra, or one can engage in something physical, such as offerings or circumambulation or prostrations, but with a mind that is virtuous. Any virtuous deed can serve as the power of the antidote. So that then, in brief, are the four opponent powers.
The Dipa Shasya, the Kihoduya Dagara, Kihoduya, the Dipa de Shadow, and Dipa Shas, Dipa de Kahoyores, and the Lulu Mare, as a Semgit, the same. That Dipa, you must Dipa Chibi, Nubi, Bacha, the Semgit in the Shashore. She's not done some do and gave Java some time do. Same day, gave Java the Nuba Cher, the detail to Semgit, gave Bacha the Nuba Cher, the Dibi Ranchi Bacha, the Ranching Nuba Chong to Gorba. She's not the name, said Gawa Diba Sha said, Gawa Duya or a Giju Duya, the Tagara Chagor. She's not that Giju Dubi Kablia, Nimbo Top, she is some Danje, some Dane Giju Duba, and Gawa the Nuba Cheg or Lejeroda, Nuba Cheg or Gores. She's not the Nimbo Top, she is some Matawaje, Giju Dubi, and Dipa Shagor, Shagor, Dipa Shagor. In other, Nimbo Topshi and some Dana, she debauching Shatuya, then around the layer, Lucina Kalaka, which is not in the Gevotambanam Nanzulia, Debashata Sonadu, Nimbo Topshi, and Nibasha, or the SS already, Nimbo Topshi sometime, and around the similar mass on the similar. Simshul mass on the Nubal mass on Che, Simshul Kase Che, the Nuba Che, and the Geshe to be the Gavadi and Nuba Che. 개와가 누가 체레나 셈이데 개와디 누가 바차 체르 셈디 개위 섬로데 갸체로도 디비기 바차 샤샤베 누바디 라신 슈 총로야 제거로 디네 인잠 지산님부터 없이 섬마다와제 개와사바이나 디바샤고라 샤고 말씀 디바샤고래 딜레르와 이나 님부터 없이 고네 섬단 디바샤바는 디 샤야게 누바체와요 레송고래.
I think it's very useful to take a moment to explain exactly what is this process of purification. So one purifies through engaging in confession. And this confession is made particularly powerful through the use of the four opponent powers. And if someone asks, is confession of negativities, or confession or purification is the same word, is confession or purification, is it also an accumulation of merit, or is it something different? Well, actually, purification is accumulation of merit. But is in a particular context, it is referred to as purification. But it really is also, just looking at it from a different perspective, purification is also accumulation of merit. So to explain this, what one is trying to purify are past misdeeds or negative acts of body, speech, or mind. So one is wanting to purify a non-virtuous imprints on the mind. Those imprints abide on the mind. When one accumulates virtue, where is this virtue? It's also on the mind. So therefore, we should understand non-virtuous imprints abide on the mind, virtuous imprints abide on the mind. So when one accumulates merit, one should understand this to mean that one is strengthening our wholesome minds, our virtuous minds. Or to express this slightly differently, we are strengthening wholesome or virtuous habitual patterns, habitual tendencies. When one accumulates non-virtue, through these non-virtuous minds, we leave non-virtuous imprints or strengthening non-virtuous habitual patterns in our way of thinking. So by understanding this, we see the process of both accumulation of merit and purification as being to purify the mind of non-virtuous ways of thinking through strengthening virtuous ways of thinking. And the accumulation of virtue is exactly that, strengthening virtuous ways of thinking. So why then the usage of these four opponent powers? Well, if one wants to purify unwholesome ways of thinking or unwholesome tendencies, any one or any collection of these four opponent powers, so 1, 2, or 3 of them, can serve to weaken non-virtuous habitual tendencies. All four together, though, are very powerful and thereby purify so much more. So if one engages in purification, but for whatever reason all four are not complete, it doesn't mean purification didn't happen. It certainly did. But when all four opponent powers are present, the purification will be stronger because the wholesome mind that is generated through these four opponent powers, these minds are that much more powerful. So then, in brief, this process of purification comes down to weakening our non-virtuous habitual tendencies, our non-virtuous imprints, and the process of doing so is through strengthening our wholesome virtuous ways of thinking, so that these become more of our natural way to respond to situations that in the past our natural way to respond, or rather than a natural, our habitual way to respond, would have been non-virtuous or afflicted.
Dipa shaya de kye chimbore, sa kye chimbo, ninji meji dipa sha hore, se de dipa shiwa kye chimbo shiwa sungorwa. Chesa, tanga jige Geshe Thubten Yanla Dunji Kone, Nikao Tupure, Yanla Dunane Divashaba Digora, Divashaba di Mekimo. Sinadiga Ranzolia, Divasha, the Chimpusu, Imbadikumza, Garelana, Diva de Mashabana, Dibu, Dibu de Langansola Maki Hongorwana. Ansona Kevana, Ansung, Dunga, Yonga, Kanga Tego, but the Baswa, the Ai Dishe Moche. And Digalia, Ansung, Tendelia, and to Geshe Thubten Tablam said, Shin no Comborwa, Neo Palada, Yama, Idale, Gala, New York, that didn't roll in it. Passion and Geshe Thubten Galahabo. Just like Geshe Thubten Galahabo and then Diva Jet in the Bay, Yellow water, to Indonesia Lamsa, Diva Jella, Jigga Kangakuni, Macarena Chetu, Tibachetu or what, Tibasat or Gava Thubten did that, Shindune Galahabo Chayo. Just like the Nenza, Danger in Milutari, Lada Mugo Montoya, Kusadi. Nandri Tenla, Galahabo, Shucha. Says that Gadina, the name Androla Kavana, and Dene Chigi, Nandril Yana, Yando Kora, Nandril Yakora, Hordead, Mother, Dendril Tayala, Shindo Galakabo Chagoro, Denenza, Nanzuki, Nandro de Legia, the Targo Gures, says that the Makiava the Subsubchore, the Gia Gudi, Karasan Divasiade, says that Divasiade, Yama Jesavani, the Pamela Shahures, Gavatu Gures, then Chinchinema, Saba de Chimes and Damja Chagores, and Duchin Chagotini, and also like Kimare. Then also Makia and then as she's on the Gawaki in Dendral Kirua. That Dendral Kia somewhere another Duchin and also sometime Dendral Kia and Sosugi, Nen as a Chubene, Delia set up Tablam Mambu Yobache, and raw chicken Yoba, Tablam Yoba, Sosugi, and some Tatoyagi, Susugi, Luki, Nen as in a Sayagi, Tablam Mambu Yoba. And the Sayatuya, the toy in a Denike Gangan Sayagi, Jiggy Ganga Chua, the Ganga Tevene, Ganga Sayagi, Tablam Ma Yoba. And the Galia, Sosugi, Geshe Thubten, Sosugi Tuyagi, Nuba Yoba, Chisa, Rijan Pandoja, Rangi Komjea, Rangi, Bechi Tesam Roy, Chasan Gohabia, but Twin Chasan Sandova Chagua, Chisa, Danger Military Tobo, Military Tobachi, Chisa D. Naso Toy, Ditobana, then Delia, and Geshe Yaya to do, then it happened that Tamjaki Komotolia, Tanya, Dini, and then you do on your moana and get in the Devan Devadungures, Cesadan Anzuki, Maranzo, Nega Copa, Negap the Tinti, Hadami Komoto, Tinto, Pekachimore, Nasong, Gia, the Pakaya, Pekachimores, Cesadi, Yachim Imbigum Zendi, Dendula Devana, Detalia, Anzu Geshe Thubten Tabla Mambu Yoba. Now, Nansong at the Lekabana, the negative to a Tabla Meba, Gangajina, Gangasega, Tabla Meba, Wintunga Yoduba, Denish to us, the names are not the Tibasha, the Kitchimore. Tibasha, the Gao to Longore, Gao to you, the Digawiti would Mobanan, the Dendral Kia, the Chagua, Dendral in the Dendritilla, and Devanyo the Chagua, Ducine, the Kitchimo in this. The names are Tibasha, the Kitchimore.
Purification is something of great importance for all of us to engage in. So we, in the text, though, within the presentation on the seven limb prayer, which is presented here as a skillful technique to prepare the mind so that it is of sufficient quality for the generation of bodhicitta. So of the seven limbs, confession is the third. Confession or purification is the third. And it is specifically mentioned that it has its own limb or branch of practice because this process of purifying the mind from non-virtuous imprints is of great importance. And this needs to be understood well so as to serve as an impetus for us to put time and energy into our purification practice. So firstly, to understand, to come to truly recognize the importance of purification, one recognizes our very situation, which is that death can come at any time. And the imprint that is strongest on our continuum will determine our next rebirth. And should that be a non-virtuous imprint, our rebirth can only be in the lower realms. And why this is such a disaster for an individual is not merely because they will experience a life of intense suffering. And it's not merely because that life could be of tremendous length as well. But the real reason why rebirth in the lower realms is such a disaster for that individual is that in the lower realms, it is very difficult to accumulate virtue. Because depending on the realm, it could be due to stupidity, it could be due to the intensity of suffering. But it becomes very difficult to accumulate virtue, and much easier than as a human being. In the lower realms, it can be much easier to accumulate non-virtue. And the result of that is, one is accumulating very few causes that have the strength to propel one, when death comes, out of the lower realms and back into the higher realms. But one is accumulating many causes that will lead to ongoing rebirth in the lower realms. And this is why rebirth in the lower realms is such a disaster for that individual being. Their spiritual progression is severed. Not forever, but for a significant period. For lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, the being is bound in the gravely suffering lower realms with very little hope of a rebirth again as a human being. So therefore, the being's spiritual development is greatly impeded. Whereas, on the other hand, by applying oneself to purification, so that is the first point of reflection, to encourage one to engage in purification. And furthermore, by engaging in the four opponent powers, purifying through the four opponent powers, to the extent that one engages wholeheartedly, one purifies past misdeeds through the accumulation of virtue. And this serves then also to develop our strength of mind to break unwholesome habitual tendencies. So we start to respond less frequently in an afflicted manner and more frequently in a wholesome manner. So to re-express this, by engaging wholeheartedly, sincerely in purification, we start to alter our habitual tendencies. And where we used to make the same mistake again and again, we start to move away from that way of responding and responding to in the same situation, but in a wholesome way. This means we have ever less causes on our continuum that can lead to rebirth in the lower realms, and we are creating ever more causes that will lead to ongoing rebirth in the higher realms. And not only that, because these causes refer to virtue that we are creating, in our rebirth in the higher realms, we will have ever better conditions. For example, we won't experience impoverishment. We'll have an abundance of material goods such as nutritious food and so forth. We'll also, in addition to material comfort, we'll seek out the teachings, we'll meet the teachings with ease, and they will touch us again, inspire us again, and thereby our spiritual development will continue, and our attainment of liberation will come ever nearer. So through these 2 points of reflection, we come to recognize the great importance of engaging in purification, the grave fault that follows from not doing so, the great likelihood of falling to the lower realms, and the tremendous benefit of engaging in purification, the likelihood of ongoing good rebirths and our ongoing spiritual development. And instead of the possibility of liberation being practically severed by falling into the lower realms, our liberation comes ever closer. So in this way we come to the conclusion through these 2 reflections, that by engaging in purification in this very life, we will experience less problems and have more happiness through changing our way of thinking. And in lives to come, our conditions will be ever better and our spiritual development will be greatly enhanced. So therefore, through this reflection, we come to see the tremendous importance of engaging repeatedly in purification practice.
Then that Janshu Simbi, Jobala, Jubale, and Divaship Liu Nibao, Sedang, and Junju Liu, that Divaship Liu, the Divadu Tovarvada. Janshu Simbi, Jobala, Jubale, Divaship Liu Nibao, that you Tangba Liu Niba, that Divashap Liu, the Oduxin, Delia Judivarva.
So then in the Tibetan, we don't have it in English, because now the Tibetan has the chapter name at the end of the chapter, whereas in English we always put it at the beginning. So the section ends with, this is engaging in the Bodhisattva activity of purification or confession.
The Dipa said, Dipa Chishu Mangu Yungore, Chizanda, and Zuki Dipa Chembora Chevena, Chisho di Nyawalkia, Dele Chungachina, Idalkia, and Dele Chungshu de Dundrolakia. The Dipa Chungshu of China, and Digi Devo Dungache, Yongo, Dendrit and Yongo, that in the Shungur. Chizanda, the Dipa Chazangi, Dipa Garasabena Chazan Dendro. Then Dipo Chunjura Chevene, Dendro de la Dunga Yunga di Chago Regede. Dendro. Is that Nyawakia, the Ida, Dunduk, Nasanki, Gucci, Matuken. Then they didn't Dipa Chuchuan, Dendro Delia, and Dunga Yunga, Yungurwa, do a table, Minga Chagua. Is that Dipa Sasa Tamji, Dipa Sawa Tamji, Nasanki, Guchago, Maridangine.
Non-virtuous imprints are of varying strength. So if a non-virtuous imprint ripens at the time of death and is of great strength, it will ripen in a result of tremendous suffering, namely rebirth in hell. If it is the non-virtuous imprint that ripens at the time of death is of middling strength, it will ripen in a rebirth of tremendous suffering, but not as bad as the hell realm, but rather as a spirit. Whereas if it's a non-virtuous imprint of minor strength that ripens at the time of death, it will lead to a rebirth as an animal. But not all non-virtuous imprints necessarily have the potential, or the strength, to lead to rebirth in the lower realms. Many will be experienced and many non-virtuous imprints will be experienced in the higher realms, such as a human being, as a suffering experience experienced by a human being. So human beings in the higher realms, but will experience the suffering results of non-virtuous imprints. So therefore, not all non-virtuous imprints will lead to rebirth in the lower realms.
Simjenju Soju Jeje, Soje di Le, and then Gewachima Hanson Gegi, Le Sahuena, Delia, and the Le de Savala, Simjen Soje, because Tungian Mason, Chagil Mason Hiro Sangu, she. Chagin Mason, she, Kichu, Sangu, when Hanson Gegi. Simjen Soju Jeje, the Soju lady, and also a gag, Le Saba de la Kishu Sangu.
So to take an illustration, that of killing a sentient being, so this can ripen as a rebirth in the hell realm, and there are actually, maybe you could say, 4 divisions to this potential ripening effect.
Thank you, Geshe Thubten Rabten, the Simjen, the Sudu, Kunong Gore, Kunong Jixi. Then the Subica Jawaji, Joa. Then the Joa, Masunia, Dirija Jorva, Joache. Then the Subica, Mushitiche. Subica Jawishiche, Wishiche, Subica Wishiche, Suicina, he sues us on Jixon and Piggy, that Bendigo some of Jore. This some of Shitango Gore. This she must have Simjen survey in there. So, Dipa Sagor, Nanson Yagi, Penjigli said the Sago Mare. Sagmare, she Tama, Jigma Sandana, she Matsadina, she got Sango Goreje, she not the Jigma Savaina, then Dipa Sagor in a Nanson Yagi, Le said the Sago Mare, she get to Yagi, Penjigli said Sago Mare.
So just to clarify or correct what I said before as a translator. So the killing of a sentient being is non-virtuous, and it can lead to rebirth in the hell realms. But this act of killing a sentient being has 4 aspects. So that was my mistake. It has 4 aspects, not 4 divisions. Now, to what Geshe said, those 4 aspects are the basis, or the sentient being that is killed, the motivation, the performance, and the completion of the act. So these are the 4 aspects. The basis, the motivation, the performance, and the recognition that it has of the completion. If any of these are missing, any of these 4 aspects are missing, that non-virtuous imprint will not have the strength to lead to a rebirth in the lower realms.
Tenazo combadia do simje as a hamo busin mango sigur what the sugar in Gabriel Yang chula that in a kalana leburo san she had mangurva. Then as a chipazo drodicala combadia dusin bus chick mango sugar de as Dambolia Sudiki Kuno Mevachik. Kuno was Chamjam do Gambi doset and Busevena, Budhisattvas Kuno Yomarwa. And then that's so big. Java and Java Jikor my campaign named Java Sugore, Java Changor, Java the Mushi the Sangor, in a studio Gunoyo Mare, and the Tama de Laya, and the Jixwa Sembigi, Tangi Corsua House and Jixwa Sembe, some of the Yomare, Mevanza, and the Bus campaign named Hamawacha Busevena, and the Divasagor and Divache, in a D. Semchen Subi, Divasavare, thank digging us on the Kegi, Penjigi lady, Sayoma, as word. The Tibetiki, Nanson, the key to go, Madame. Then Nanson, so that the Enriquez Madame Nanson Giaglesi, sure.
To give an illustration, we do kill many insects without the intention to do so. For example, when walking, we inadvertently kill. But of these 4 aspects, the intention is clearly missing, and there is a basis. In other words, it was a sentient being that we inadvertently stood on, for example, and killed. There was a performance in that we took that step, but there was no intention or motivation to kill. There was also the 4th step was missing, that recognition that I have now killed. That too is missing. So therefore, those 4 aspects are not complete, and therefore, this non-virtuous act lacks the strength to lead to lower realm rebirth. Another illustration would be if there is an insect in our food, and an insect that's still alive, and we inadvertently cook that insect, or we eat it, and there's this living insect. There clearly there's no intention. And there's not the 4th step either, that recognition that our wish to kill had been fulfilled. So whilst there is an activity and there is a being that died, the negative deed is not complete, and therefore it lacks the strength to lead to rebirth in the lower realms.
Dene and the Subic Joache, Moshe, the Susan, Dang, Susan, Jesus, and be some Chikeva in the Dingason Lech Sagor, the Penjiki Lech Sagore. The D. Lady Leon, Top Chichungore, the D. Joada, the Niki, JB, Gabriel, Kunota, Shuk Chamboda, Pejik Konganzuki, Kongroda, Shuk Chambuchine, and Surveyna, Tangawaki, less again in Dile ne shu chungwaro shineda ji idagiyada. Denigi dile shu chungwaro nga sol kiyage, ji dunjo kiyage rochi. Chisa le khoron penjik le ji sabene le dile nube chishung kiyora. Chisa nube chungshuwa digi nga sol kiyage, dile chewa digi da idaro da. Dile chewa digi ji chishuwa digi da ma ane ji yawala kiya. Nyawale yang ji nyekam jubye sin dangi shigoro nyewe kam jubye yore se shigoro nyawa chanya dangi smangushiro jisa denigi lede kazi nube che mende duksho de kiya chagoro on dushine yungore se chi sungoro jisa deni za aji dang 파도 디바 망고 제sem자 하모고 망고 수고랑에 디바사 당아선 기그레 sembe shena kiego mede 다디 jisa deni sosugi kunloda Jovada, so sugi, Yaji 지금 좋아하다 쇠되게 좋은 것을 맞제베네 맞제바제 안 쇠사베네 어당이 어떤 쇠선 빼서서 넣어서 선배선 교발을 계산해 안디 쇠선선 비디비 톱로 탈 뒤서선 좀 탈도도 기고 말해 진짜 맞제바자 탈도 맞제바자 디바 편지기 레사 사투고 말해야지 어디 내게다 레기 남자 두신에 딱 망부용 거를 다니게 레다 지기 레 제바레데 소시바 레 제바레데 레 사요 말해서나 다 소수가 맞제베네 안 소수 레 사요 봐 소수가 맞제바지 어디 미디케 소로시아지 미션다지는 아지 소주베나 소수가 수고 말 내가 자원 것을 지고 말때 굴롱 안 소수기 쇠도 굴롱 여바지 근데 소수기 안 미쇠사바나 안 소수가 다 디스와 선배기 탈도 깨바이나 미션치는 아버네 현재 좋아지게 미션다기 지고로 쇠가 좋아지 소용없이 현다지고데 소수기 굴롱이야 쇠 굴롱이 미션다지를 계속으로지서 나 세우지라 그 쇠바 쇠송사다 하고 선도 어당에 쇠 디스와 선배기 되게 탈도 깨서나 되는 미수의 편지기 내셔야돼 기사고 진짜 디기 아주 소수기 제어마데 좋아하던 것이디 랑기 맞제본 것을 제바단 현라 나지 제주바 이용을 지사도 좋아 참고래 랑기 좋아데 랑기 지무시도 좋아데 랑기 제어마데 현랑 아지 현기 제반자 좋아던 것이도 참고래 타도도 군노도 소설을 여바래 지사 레사고 지사 소소한 것을 맞제바네 현래 제주바네 디바사고다디
On the other hand, just staying with the illustration of taking life, if one does so with these four aspects complete, one has the intention to kill. There is a living being, so the basis that one kills, then one does the action and has the recognition that now I've killed. Then that's a complete act, and it has the strength to, should it ripen at the time of death, to propel rebirth into the lower realms. That being said, though, within such imprints, there remains a tremendous variety in strength of that imprint, because within any of the four aspects, there can be a variety of strength of that particular aspect. So, just to take one of the four, the aspect of intentional motivation. If one is killing out of anger, anger we know has a great variety in terms of its strength. So if one is so in Tibetan, it's just one word we translate as anger, but to then use words from English which are wider. If one kills with full-blown rage or hatred, that because of the grave strength of the motivation, that imprint accumulated will be so much more powerful than if one killed, say, through annoyance. And so, depending on the strength of the varying components, such as intention, leads to the strength of the imprint, and therefore the strength of the suffering results that will follow. So, for example, in the hell realms, we know that in total there are 18 different hell realms. And why is there such variety? Because of the variety in strength of the various aspects of that lead to the accumulation of the karmic imprint. So I've just mentioned one part of variety, which could be in terms of the intention, but certainly in terms of the being that is killed, or in terms of the way that the killing is done, and so forth. There will, from these various aspects, will be a change in the strength of the imprint. So this is good to understand, not so that we can excuse certain non-virtuous deeds, or that we can know how to engage in non-virtue skillfully, but so that we know what we need to purify, what is of gravest danger to us, and focus on purifying in that way. But what this comes down to is, in terms of karmic results, there's tremendous variety, because of the great variety in terms of the karmic causes. And a final point to make is that in the context of killing, for an act to be complete, one doesn't need to necessarily do it oneself. If a person instructs someone else to kill, the person doing the instructing only has the intention, they are not doing the deed, and they may afterwards have the recognition that the deed was done, but they did nothing themselves, but someone else did, and someone else did so under their instruction. Therefore, they both accumulate the non-virtue of killing. So this then too shows another way by which there is variety that comes to the imprints that we accumulate, hence the great variety in ripening results that beings experience.
Yala sumni sasawa de tikasure ngazu cha sawa to chego huwa de dipa shawa sumni sawa de da janju sim sumi liu di ma sumi de dangbo ani gewale chi su irang ta ani chi chugyo holo koro sowa de ba nyanga lembe de ba sowa de ba ne gewa ngowa ondus chene de ni janju sim sumi na di ondus yugore di mo.
So now we've concluded the second chapter. Next week we'll start with the third chapter. The third chapter, the title is translated in varying ways, one of which is fully adopting bodhicitta or taking hold of bodhicitta. That culminates with the taking of or generation of bodhicitta. But the chapter first, it concludes the 7 limb prayer, because we have now concluded looking at the limbs of prostration, offerings, and confession. So next week we'll start then with the first verses, which are to do with the limb of rejoicing, and that will follow with the limb of requesting teachings, then the limb of requesting for our teachers to remain, and so forth, culminating in the taking of the commitment of bodhicitta. So that's where we'll continue from next week.
Oh yeah, let me see you what you might have to just
And if you have questions, then please feel free to ask. Kathy?
How do you know if your non-virtuous acts have been purified?
How do you know if your non-virtuous acts have been purified?
지단에 뭐저기 되니기 디샤 제게도 저는 냠는 제네 제도 갑라 냠는 제도 안 니람나야 안지 수부주야 토야다 안 수부주도 소소게 빠빼지 디와 수분 바지 나다 되네 쪽으로 된조바 토야라서 받아 근데 니마 샤와라서 토베네 디바 다베게 다사해서 다 베네 치장서 니람네 다산데 되네 용거리에서 되니긴 썸 나무를 귤라 야 썸는 소소게 기회 삼라데 슈처 소소 냠뇨토네 슈처 게디나 기회 삼라데 마마 주기네 데스 디바다베 다사르 난게 다다 치다로 되네시 중고로.
Two ways to know. The one is to do with when we awake, and the other to do when we asleep. So when we are sleeping, be aware of one's dreams. And there are certain signs within dreams that are said to be signs of successful purification, such as in one's dreams, one is washing one's body, or one is in sunlight. So these are said to be signs of success in purification. But perhaps something that's easier to observe is to be aware of natural or unforced changes in our ways of thinking. Whereas in the past, we would respond to particular stimuli in an unwholesome manner, we are now naturally responding in a different way, in a wholesome manner. And there one can see a change in one's thinking. And from this we can appreciate that there has been success in our purification.
다 되니게 가는 중에 지되니게 딱선 땅 에바 젠디 직제 되게 니람 통제 담질의 시기에 살다 니람 땅 니람 따에기 뒤쇠로 지어와 그디 나 니람 통나 어수 지하다 니마샤 니람 통나 디부다기 따 세고 말 다소수기 디베제기 디베 개조 줍 디바샤도 진 제 데네기 제비기 깽기 단 도시는 아주 니람 통해야 되나 지게 토랑 값소 토랑의 값소 데네기 다산지게 직도시는 니람을 리고나 대수 디바답에 따라서 온도시네 순거래.
Just to say further on dreams, because in general dreams are not seen as having any particular meaning and are not to be relied on and analyzed or interpreted, but just to let go of. And that is also the case here in terms of the particular signs, because I've mentioned a few, but there are others as well, which are said to be signs of purification. In this context, it's not that whenever one has a dream of being in the sunshine or one's body being washed, that is necessarily a sign of purification. This could just be something ripening in one's mind as one sleeps. Where one could maybe rely on such a sign is during a period when one is focusing on one's purification, where one does have a strong emphasis on purification. Then one can perhaps consider such a dream to be a more reliable sign than at another time.
Yeah.
Thank you.